There's a MAGA civil war brewing over a former ally of the president being closely aligned with Jeffrey Epstein. New Epstein files reveal how close Steve Bannon, the one time strategy officer for Trump's campaign, really was with Jeffrey Epstein leading up to the day he was arrested in 2019. Now there's massive MAGA fallout over this, and people are pointing fingers at Bannon, maybe hoping to excommunicate him and save Trump's reputation. There are hundreds of recognizable names in the Epstein files, but the various powerful figures within them also had various degrees of closeness with Jeffrey Epstein. One of the people who appeared to be closest to him in the days and months leading up to his arrest and death was Steve Bannon, pictured here in a mirror selfie taken with Jeffrey Epstein at some point between 2016 and 2019. According to documents in the newly released Epstein files, as well as reporting from outlets like CNN, Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein developed a rather close connection sometime after Bannon was booted from Trump's administration in 2017. Steve Bannon was the CEO of the 2016 Trump campaign that initially landed Trump in the presidency. He also carried that position into Trump's first term, working in the White House until he was unceremoniously booted from that office in 2017, at which point he began to develop a friendship with the convicted sex offender. In this photo, you have Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein sitting across a desk from one another in Epstein's office. Steve Bannon and Epstein were even so close that Bannon was one of the last people Epstein was texting with on the day that he was arrested in New York City in 2019. That day, according to text messages in the Epstein files, Bannon and Epstein were talking about filming some sort of documentary to rehabilitate Epstein's reputation. They had plans to meet, but Epstein texted him, all canceled. This was right before Epstein was taken into custody in New York, where he would eventually die from suicide. Now, according to CNN and the Epstein files, Epstein and Bannon were often discussing things like European politics and how they could spread far right political ideas around the world. Famously, Trump and Epstein were close friends, but the two gravitated away from each other before Trump was elected president. Still, Epstein was weighing in on his presidency from the sidelines, oftentimes in direct communication with Steve Bannon. Epstein actually advised Bannon on how he could talk about things like Trump's trade policies up to 2018. And since these Epstein files came out, a lot of high profile conservatives have been attacking Steve Bannon for his close connection to Epstein. It's interesting because despite being excommunicated from Trump's first administration, Bannon has remained someone who's been in his corner in the years since. After leaving the administration, Steve Bannon started his War Room podcast, where he's been a loud and vocal supporter of Donald Trump ever since, even advocating for him to remain president in 2028 against the Constitution. But MAGA figures like Elon Musk have in more recent weeks pointed the finger at Steve Bannon over his connection to Epstein, calling out the fact that he appears in the files so frequently and appears to have had such a close relationship with him. One exchange between Bannon and Epstein that has gotten a lot of attention in MAGA circles is this text conversation from 2018. On the last day of the year, December 31st, Epstein wrote to Steve Bannon, "Hell of a year. Next will be biblical." Bannon replied, "We either own 2019 or it will surely own us." And Epstein replied, "I'm back in the F&B biz only." F&B director, said Bannon. Then Epstein made a lewd comment and he wrote, "Spoke to my Dems this weekend. Boy, are emotions running high." Bannon replied, "The White House has zero plan to punch back. Fort Apache with no cavalry en route." Epstein said, "And no soldiers in the fort. He really is borderline. Not sure what he may do." And Bannon said, "I think it's beyond borderline. 25th Amendment." Now, this comment from Bannon has in particular garnered a lot of attention because the 25th Amendment outlines ways to secede the president if he dies in office or is removed for other reasons. It lays out the line of succession for the vice president and other official members of the government in case the president can no longer serve his duty. So a lot of people in MAGA world are now suggesting that Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein were behind this idea that Trump should be removed from office. This is a convenient theory for MAGA because it places all of the doubts about Trump's ability to serve in office at the foot of one of the most notorious sex traffickers of all time and someone who they feel they can afford to kick out of the party, Steve Bannon. But the reality is, at this time in Trump's first term, at the very end of 2018, it wasn't just Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein who were talking about the 25th Amendment. There were serious disasters happening in the Trump administration. If we rewind the clock back to the end of 2018, which is when these text messages took place, The Guardian had compiled this helpful guide to the worst weeks of Trump's presidency so far. And from Monday, the 10th of December to Friday, the 14th of December 2018, one expert said this week was nothing short of disastrous. In fact, this may just be Trump's worst week of his presidency, and that's no easy feat. So, what happened this week? Well, Trump was looking for his next chief of staff, and his favored pick removed himself from the running. And then his second favored choice, Chris Christie, also dropped out of the running. And at the exact same time, Trump was also demanding funding for a border wall, even against some of the people in his own party. His longtime aide, Michael Cohen, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for crimes including lying to Congress and making illegal payments to silence two women who alleged affairs with Trump. Cohen said he was directed to make the payments by Trump, directly implicating the president. And then the week after that, Trump started laying the groundwork to shut down the government over this funding dispute for his highly contested border wall. This border wall funding dispute did end with a government shutdown. And at the time, it was the longest shutdown in US government history, surpassed only by Trump just a few months ago. This shutdown started on December 22nd and lasted until January 25th, 2019. So this was the context around Bannon and Epstein discussing invoking the 25th Amendment and removing Trump from office. They weren't the only ones talking about this at the time, but we can now see modern MAGA allies trying to rewrite history and lay the blame squarely at Bannon's feet. Mike Flynn, who was Trump's former national security advisor, tweeted in response to this text exchange, and he wrote, "The White House, or at least Department of Justice, needs to come out and say what they plan on doing with this information. I remember all the 25th Amendment talk back in the first term. It was really ugly. If Bannon and Epstein were behind it, Bannon needs to be brought in for questioning, and he needs to address this and all the other shit he was doing on behalf of Epstein." Former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who left her position over the Epstein Files and Trump, added on to this, writing, "I agree completely. Steve Bannon went to jail for Trump. I was there. But back on January 1st, 2019, after Dems took the House, he was texting with Epstein about the 25th Amendment. Also, there is no excuse for having such a friendly relationship with Epstein post conviction, 2018 to 2019. What's interesting about this is that Marjorie Taylor Greene almost seems to be defending Trump here, saying that Steve Bannon shouldn't have been talking about removing him from office. But just a few days ago, she also said on a podcast that Trump was one of the people who fought the hardest to block these Epstein files from being released in the first place. And like I said, she's leaving her position as Congresswoman over her issues with Trump and the Epstein files. Specifically on this podcast, Marjorie Taylor Greene said, "The only reason that Trump signed our bill that we passed in the House was because he had to. It became a massive political problem." The biggest political miscalculation in Donald Trump's career was calling this a hoax, fighting the release of it, and having Mike Johnson, the speaker, refuse to bring the bill to the floor, to the point where Thomas Massie, myself, Nancy Mace, Lauren Boebert actually had to vote with all of the Democrats to get it released. So here we have a classic case of she's so close to getting it, but she's not quite there. At the root of all of this is Donald Trump. Trump himself was very close with Epstein before his initial 2008 conviction. Trump fought the release of the Epstein files contemporaneously, and Trump is implicated in thousands of Epstein file documents. Marjorie Taylor Greene understands the second half of that, but she's still sticking to the party line when it comes to people's reasonable concerns and desires to remove Trump from office back in 2018. And for the rest of the MAGA party, they're scrambling to cure this cognitive dissonance around Trump, who they still support, and everything that's been revealed in the Epstein files so far. What they're trying to do here is they're trying to pin blame on auxiliary figures like Steve Bannon so that they can avoid the bigger question at the heart of this, which is that the person who currently is sitting in the Oval Office is implicated beyond any of these other people in the Epstein files. Trump was even accused of crimes in the Epstein files, and those crimes have yet to be fully investigated. But instead, his MAGA allies are pointing the finger at people like Steve Bannon and accusing him of disloyalty instead of looking at the bigger picture here, which is getting to the bottom of these alleged crimes. Now, that's not to say that Steve Bannon is innocent in this either. He maintained an extremely close friendship with Jeffrey Epstein after that 2008 conviction. In fact, they only met after Trump was elected president the first time. And in addition to that, Bannon was working to rehabilitate Epstein's reputation. He wanted to undermine the sex trafficking allegations, not bring justice to the case. But the reason that MAGA is scrambling right now is because none of them look good in the fallout of the Epstein files. That's the reason why Trump, Pam Bondi, and the Department of Justice have worked so hard to try to prevent these files from becoming public. Up until this day, they still have yet to release and unredact many of these filings that implicate powerful people, including the president. At the end of the day, Steve Bannon appears to be a very opportunistic figure. He was one of the people most responsible for Trump becoming president in the first place, but then he was kicked out of Trump's administration, and behind the scenes, he was bashing him and talking about removing him from office. But publicly, he's remained incredibly loyal to Trump, using the MAGA base to profit and remain relevant, even past his own role in the Trump administration. But what the Epstein files ultimately reveal is just how culpable everyone was involved in this scandal and the ongoing cover up. So, yes, Steve Bannon should be brought in for questioning, but so should Donald Trump. And so should all of the other political figures named in the file, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. That doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, anybody who helped enable these crimes must be held to account. And while MAGA might be able to use the Steve Bannon text messages as a distraction, at the end of the day, that's what people are going to be looking for.